Good evening all, and welcome. Being followed home is an uncomfortable, unnerving, and disturbing experience. I hope none of you ever have to feel it. I've got some pre-video announcements. Number one, I am looking for stories from the states of the USA. I've got a big video planned, one story per state, 50 stories. I've got about 4 states right now. So if you live in the States and you have a horror story, then, write to me, put the state in the email so that I know, and maybe we can make this video soon. Second announcement, poop stories. Why don't we have more poop stories? Send in your poop catastrophes, and I'll make a fun, light-hearted video for the future. And 3, I am now posting subscriber artwork on Instagram and my YouTube stories and stuff, so if you want to draw something and send it to me, feel free and I will share it on my socials and stuff. Awesome. Alright then guys, so for now, it's time to get comfortable and let the darkness take control. I live in a little city in SoCal with my roommate who happens to be my cousin. During this coronavirus pandemic, I've been staying with my parents who live in a very small town in NorCal. Because of my time in SoCal, I really do not like staying in NorCal, and I would rather live back in my apartment. The reason why I haven't is because my parents think I will get very lonely there since everything is closed and my roommate is not there, as he's also staying with his parents. However, since I had to go back for a specific reason, my parents wanted me to take their dog, Mocha, so I wouldn't feel as lonely staying there. I loved her and didn't mind one bit. Mocha is a small, pomchy dog that loves to play around with me and usually is by my side for most of the time. She also loves to go on runs with me, so I occasionally do take her on jogs. On a Wednesday night, I decided to go running with her. Whenever I go on any runs, I go at night, because that's the time I am most energetic, and all the times I went running at night, I never had any type of encounter or occurrences. I put Mocha on a leash and we went out. About 20 minutes into our run, I was running through this creek. There was a park next to it, and a bunch of trees surrounding it, houses to the other side. The trail was pretty narrow, and the street lamps were pretty dim, but still bright enough to see up ahead. As I'm running with music playing, my leash was tugged by Mocha. This usually happens when she wants to go to the bathroom, so I stopped to let her do her thing. But when I turned around, she was in her alert stance, looking straight behind me, where we had ran. I just assumed that she heard a squirrel or any small animal as she usually does. I was tugging her leash, telling her to let go and that there's nothing there. She didn't oblige at first. She kept looking behind us. It took about 4 to 5 tugs before she finally came to me. I resumed playing my music and we both went off running. I was almost out the creek, and then I would meet a narrow sidewalk that was straight ahead. The trail only had to take a short turns. Probably a minute or 2 later, Mocha tugged the leash again and went on her alert stance behind me. She did an aggressive bark and started growling. I stopped and was looking all around behind us. I was kind of freaked out because the trail had a couple of turns and curves. This meant that something was most likely following us. My first guess was a lost dog, which is unsettling as Mocha is tiny. If it were a big dog, I can easily overpower her. As I was looking around the dim area for a split second, I saw a black humanoid figure 15 yards away, right behind a bush next to a tree. I immediately turned my eyes to the opposite direction, and pretending that I did not see him, but boy, my heart was pounding. I didn't see any figures or his face, just the outline of his upper body. I didn't have a weapon of any sort. If this guy was following me, my best solution would be to run off without him catching me. I tried to act cool and told Mocha we should go. The trail was going to end, and I just had to make a turn, and it would be a straight sidewalk about 300 to 400 yards. There are fences on both sides of the sidewalk, so the only solution was to keep running forwards. I went at a jog right as I turned the corner and made sure that I was out of view from the person as I went into a full-on sprint as quietly as I could. The sidewalk was ahead of me, so I made sure just to keep running and kept looking behind me to see if I was really being followed. About 70 yards away, I saw a person come to view from the turn, then went sprinting as fast as he could towards me. As if I wasn't sprinting, I went sprinting as fast as I could, and I never have sprinted that fast in my life. Looking back, it amazed me on how fast I ran. Mocha was actually keeping up with me about 100 yards of sprinting. I looked back, and he was still full on running behind me. He was wearing a dark hoodie, sweatpants, and appeared to be at least 6 foot tall. He was still in that same distance that I noticed him from, which meant he must have been pretty fast as well. The sidewalk was going to end at about 100 yards, and it would lead to a neighborhood. I could lose him there. I was slowly getting out of breath. My adrenaline was beginning to die down. I kept sprinting, hoping I wouldn't get tired too quickly. 100 yards of me sprinting, and I finally made it to the neighborhood out of breath. This neighborhood was pretty broad, so if I were to keep running, the person would have spotted me right away, and the pace he was running, it didn't seem like a good idea. My solution was to hide. I went straight to a random house, jumped over their backyard where I would be kept hidden by the fence. I basically threw Mocha over on myself, and we were both panting, but I tried to keep quiet as I heard footsteps coming by. The guy had finished the trail and was now in the neighborhood. He stopped running and I heard him panting. I hear him mutter as he was out of breath and kept saying, "What the hell?" I was holding Mocha, scratching her so she wouldn't bark or growl. About 5 minutes later, I heard footsteps retreating away and slowly fading. I waited in 10 minutes in complete silence to be sure he wasn't close by when I peeked my head around the fence, and it was all alone now. I get Mocha and went to the opposite direction from where I heard the guy go. Even though I was tired, I tried to jog just so that I could go home sooner. I kept looking around me. I was very paranoid of that guy. He could be anywhere. I made it back home with no problem, and I've got to thank Mocha for pretty much telling me that someone was behind me and stalking us. I don't know how long he was following us for, or what he was planning to do. I just hope he didn't get a clear glimpse of my face, because I certainly don't want to run into him again. This happened over 10 years ago, when I was in my early 20s, but I still remember it like it was yesterday. I've only shared this story with my family and a few friends, and it happened when I was living in Japan, so it was pretty normal to see people doing the whole cosplay thing, and I'd see people dressed up in characters and dressed differently, but this was something else. I was out with a friend one night having a few drinks, just the usual dinner and booze at an izakaya lounge. Back then, it was pretty normal for me to either walk home or taxi home after midnight, since the train stopped operating at half midnight to 1 a.m. This was the case for many people that enjoyed the nightlife. It would often be pretty busy in the streets around that time. This particular night, my friend wanted to go clubbing with some of our other friends, but I had a pretty early morning start, so decided to walk home. I lived about a 25-minute walk away from the area we were drinking at. I often took a few shortcuts through some alleyways to get home quicker. As I turned the corner in one alleyway, I was face to face with a guy wearing a clown face paint, but more like the Joker, as I mentioned. It was pretty normal for me to see people with cosplay and dressed differently, so I walked past him with a smile and kept walking. As I passed him, I noticed he had some blood on his clothes, which made me feel a little uncomfortable, but I kept walking. That's when I realized he started following me. I even made some unorthodox turns in different streets to try and get away, and I walked faster, but he kept following. I turned around and asked him if he was okay and if he needed help. That's when he put a big smile on his face, started giggling, and pulled out a kitchen knife. I got freaked out, so immediately turned around and started running away from him. He then burst out in a screaming laugh and started skipping towards me. As I started running fast, he too then started running fast. As I was running away from him, I could still hear him giggling and running towards me. I was running for about 3 minutes when I noticed a small construction site with garbage on the side of it. I saw one of those metal rods used in construction and I quickly picked it up, turned around and yelled at him. We both came to a complete stop. He saw me with the metal rod and stopped running. I yelled at him and swung the metal rod once and told him that if he stepped closer I'd hit him. With that he stopped, and I began walking backwards to make sure I wasn't being followed. After about a block of doing so, he was just standing there, and I turned and began running home. I'll never know what he was trying to do, just scare me, or if it was an actual psychopath trying to kill me. Either way, it was one of the scariest things in my life that has ever happened to me. I am a 21-year-old female. It was June 2019, and I was doing a closing shift at the McDonald's I worked at in a town in England, although I'm originally from Scotland. We close up at 2 AM on weekdays and 3 AM on the weekends. It has been a Saturday night shift, so I was finishing and out the building by 3:15 roughly. When this happened, I was living about a 10 to 15 minute walk away from my work in a flat that was mostly taken up by students. I didn't have money to spare to constantly get taxis to get me to and from work, and I had been walking home from night shifts for the past year with no incidents, so of course, didn't think any differently of doing it again tonight. The majority of the walk was fine, and I was about 4 minutes away from the flat when I noticed a guy just standing around near the corner I had to turn to get home. I'm very wary when I see other people, but usually they're drunk, and they mind their own business, or just ask for directions or a homeless person, as there are plenty of them in the city. This guy was dressed nice, but casual, looked to be in his mid-20s, was well-groomed with tan skin, and was really smelling strong of aftershave. He obviously was a regular at the gym too, because he looked like he had a muscular figure, and didn't seem to be drunk by the looks of him. I tried to keep my distance, but he approached me and started making really casual conversation, asking me what my name was, complimenting my accent, and asking where I was from. I stupidly engaged with him, but gave him a fake name and made it clear I wasn't up for chit-chat. I should have been firm with my words, but I was way too introverted and shy to speak up. Even my boyfriend complains I talk too quietly sometimes, and I struggle to be direct with people. Throughout the whole conversation, he's always giving me this unsettling smile and would try to touch my arm or play with my hair, which I made as clear as possible I didn't approve of and didn't like. He would just say something along the lines of, "But you're so pretty," not flattering at all when it's a man who won't take no for an answer. This guy then asks me for a hug, and even though I refused him as politely as possible, he did it anyway. I froze up for a few seconds before I moved away, which thankfully he let me do. He was being extremely creepy at this point and tried feeling over my sides as he hugged me, which gave me even more alarm bells ringing in my head. I told him I had to leave, and as I walked away I heard him say, "I'll walk you home. Where do you live?" Unfortunately, I had nowhere else to go but home. There was no one else around, and it was too early in the morning. My roommate was also back at his own house, and he went back home every weekend. I had a hold of my keys in my pocket and just hoped once I got to the building, I could find a way in without this guy being able to invite himself in. I refused the walk home, but he followed me anyway, walking about 8 to 10 feet away from me, and I was speeding up at this point and caught up as I crossed the road. I don't know why, but I decided to go the long way to get to my building, which takes an extra 2 minutes, so not that long. And as I was approaching the flats, I felt this horrible sinking feeling in my chest. The door to the building closes really slowly at first before slamming shut, so I knew even if I walked in he could potentially follow me inside, and that puts me at an even greater risk. By this point he was begging me to be let inside. He said he was extremely thirsty and wanted some water, but I told him my roommate was asleep, a subtle way to try and deter him, by showing him that I wasn't alone in the flat. But of course, that did not seem to faze him remotely. He was trying to be touchy and kept pleading with me to just let me inside, but I kept my ground and said no. As he was talking to me, I managed to use the fob on my door, which is the only way to open it. I was careful enough to slide through. However, he was right at the door, and I didn't want to make him upset, so I apologized and told him no once again. Luckily, he had moved away from the door, as someone wanted to get in the building. The guy entered the flat and asked if everything was okay when he saw me, but I stupidly said that everything was fine. That did give me a chance to move away from the door and let it close once the guy walked through. He either worked or lived here, I wasn't sure. I didn't even look back at the guy. I ran up the stairs to my flat as quickly as I could. I didn't get any sleep that night from that moment and made sure that I always had money aside from a taxi. I think I walked home once between June and October before I moved. Really scary stuff, and I'm glad that I never saw him again. This happened when I was about 7 or 8. I don't remember all the details, but I do remember some really messed up stuff. When I was a kid, I lived in a pretty sketchy neighborhood. We lived in those long apartments, the ones that are attached at the sides rather than stacked on top of each other. The front of the apartments faced the main road, and there was a little side street to access the parking and backyard of the apartments. Behind the apartments was a massive field. It was super overgrown, so much that it was almost a little forest, and my friends and I used to go back there to build hobbit holes in the grass. My mum hated it when we went out there, because there were some rough people that lived in the neighborhood, and she didn't like a group of 7-year-olds playing out there, where people also shot up heroin. One day I was out in the woods by myself, just exploring and pretending to be Indiana Jones. That's when I saw something. I was coming out of the tall grass and I could see the little back alley in between the parking/houses and the woods, and I saw a deer lying in the grass. I thought it was just sleeping, so I crept up on it to try and scare it. I know, not cool, and when I got there I knew something was off. The deer was still and smelled horrible. I couldn't see its face, as if its back were facing me. But when I got up to it I nearly had a heart attack, when I saw that its entire stomach was ripped open and all of the insides were spewed on the ground. I wasn't a smart kid, but I knew that this was messed up. When I turned to run back home to tell my mum, I saw a second deer nailed to the tree next to the first. I don't know how I didn't notice this before, but its 2 front hooves were nailed above its head to the tree. Its stomach was cut open and the ribs had been broken to expose the gaping hole. As I stood there staring at it, a car drove past on the little alley. I remember it was a white car with tinted windows and was driving really slowly. I mean, everyone drove slowly on this alley because it was a residential street, but these people were barely even moving. I couldn't see inside, but I got the sinking feeling that they were just watching me. Obviously, I can't be certain that they were the people who mutilated the deer, but I'm 99% sure that it was. Once they were gone, I booked at home and told my mum the whole thing. She told me not to go to the field anymore. Great. And I happily agreed. I didn't particularly enjoy seeing a deer's insides, and I would have loved to just forget about the whole thing. For the next month or so, I saw that car everywhere. It would drive up the main road while I was playing in the front yard. It would drive down the back alley when I would be in the front yard, and I would even remember seeing it at the grocery store when my mum and I went shopping. That could have been another tinted window white car, but they were definitely stalking the house. It was always the white car, always the tinted windows, and always driving way too slowly to be normal. I told my mum about it, but she chalked it up to just being a neighbor down the road. One day my mum was out mowing the front lawn. Because of the way the apartments were set up, she had to push the lawnmower around all of the apartments to get to our backyard. Being the helpful little kid I was going to meet my mom out back to open the gate for her so she could put the lawnmower in the little shed. As I'm walking out to the gate, I see the car come along the back alley. Normally the car goes slow. As soon as it turned the corner, however, the driver stepped on the gas and zoomed up to me. The back door closest to me was open, and someone got out and started running towards me. I don't remember what he looked like, or even if it was a he. I just remember hauling ass back into the house and pissing myself the whole time. After that, my dad yelled at me for peeing, and neither he or my mum believed me about the guy in the car. I never saw him again after that, and we moved a few months later. My parents still think I made the whole thing up, even though they knew how sketchy the neighborhood was. And I don't remember anyone going missing around that time in my town, and I didn't find anything when I googled it. But it was really messed up, and I have no idea who the people in the car were, why they mutilated the deer, or what they had planned for me. At the time of this story, I was around 13. I used to take horseback riding lessons at the center and had to travel pretty far from home to get there. Since there's no public transport where I live, they provided a shuttle to collect us at certain locations and hours. The nearest shuttle stop to my city was a city exit. Basically, this city exit was a huge traffic roundabout leading to the city ring, some huge avenues with sports centers, and the entrance of a park and forest, where the riding stables were, and also known for prostitutes. If I had children, I surely would not let them go there alone, but 14-year-old me decided that that would be the perfect spot to wait for a shuttle. I went there to take the 5:15 shuttle, arrived 30 minutes early just to be sure, and sat on a bench near one of the sports centers. It was the first time I had to take it. You had to wave to the driver in order for him to stop, but I had no idea what the shuttle even looked like. There was no logo or anything printed on the minibus, just white and blue. So I waited and waited until 4:15, and there was no shuttle. 20 minutes passed, no shuttle, and I began to panic a bit. What if I didn't see it? At this point, I was standing up. Maybe the driver would stop if he saw a young girl in riding clothes. Still nothing. It was starting to get dark. Then I noticed a car, very old one, so quite noticeable, parked a bit further up the road with a guy in it. I thought to myself that maybe he was waiting for someone in the sports center. I was, and still am, very anxious, so having a man sitting in a car with a nice view on me waiting stressed the hell out of me. Another 20 minutes go by, and bingo, a crowd of people got out the sports center, and one of them got into the car. I was relieved, or so I thought. But they didn't move. I started to panic. Now there were two guys in a car and they were watching me. In my stupid teen mind, I started to hope even more that the 6:15 shuttle would show up. It was really dark now and I really couldn't read the signs on the shuttles any longer. Scared, I decided at 6:20 it was time for me to go home. I began walking, and at that moment I moved from my spot. The guys started up their car, and I tried to stay as calm as possible and not run, because I thought that if I started running or screamed for help, they would get out their car and take me. I tried to contact my mum, but she didn't respond, and of course, my phone battery died shortly after. To get back home from there, I had to walk down one long road for approximately 10 minutes and then turn on my street. My initial plan was to kind of disappear into the crowd once I could reach the more busy area. But that night there was nobody in the streets, and I couldn't deviate from that road because I didn't know the place very well and didn't have a map. The car was clearly following me, very slowly and with its lights on max intensity. In my city, everyone drives crazy fast and never at the maximum lights because of street lighting, so it was very suspicious. 5 minutes before arriving home, the car was still behind me. It was at this moment I realized I couldn't just head straight home, because they'd know where I live. So I got this other idea, turn on a street they couldn't turn on. I finally was in my neighborhood, a place I knew like the back of my hand, so I turned on a small one-way road and ran like I never had before. I often read that people run and don't look behind them, but I did. I saw their car had stopped at the turn. They couldn't drive there because other cars were passing in the street. It was game over. I have no idea what could have happened if I'd have led them to my place, and I'm really glad they didn't get out their car. I just hope to never meet them again. When I was a little girl, I lived in an apartment complex with my mother. The entire complex consisted of 2 buildings that sat side by side, less than 100 feet apart, with 4 2-bedroom flats, 2 upstairs, 2 down. We lived about 100 yards from the hill, from a major 5-lane road, but you never would have known that due to the thick woods that bordered the complex on 3 sides. The last side was an area cut for power lines that ran next to our driveways, with a graveyard directly beyond it. It would go without saying that this setup was a recipe for many childish shenanigans as well as creepy encounters. On the front side of the complex and along the power line side were thick blackberry brambles. They weren't quite as thick along the power line area, but in the front of the apartment, you couldn't stick your arm out without being torn apart by thorns, and it was so thick, it was nearly impossible to push through. This information will be relevant later. I was the only young child that lived there full time, and all the neighbors were, to the best of my knowledge, fond of me. I was active in Girl Scouts, so when it was time, I would go around to all the neighbors for orders. When the cookies came in, I'd get my little wagon and deliver them to the neighbors by myself, because my mother knew and trusted them. The day this happened, I had taken my wagon to the other building to deliver cookies. I hadn't meant to stay as long as I had, but my mother's friend's husband had bought some new fish. I was fascinated with their aquarium and had spent about 45 minutes helping them pick out names. And when I began to walk back, dusk had fallen. I had walked about 7 steps off the porch when I got a bad feeling. Now that I'm older, I understand that I've learned to listen to my intuition. I stopped for a second to settle my stomach and I heard a noise. When I looked to the front of the apartment where the blackberries were the most thick, initially I couldn't see anything. I forget exactly what alerted me to his presence, but I think he flicked a light or something. It was like he was trying to purposefully alert me of his presence. The second I saw him, I froze. He had shoulder-length, stringy black hair, bad skin, and looked like a skeleton. Knowing what I know now, I imagine he was probably strung out. I realized when he knew I saw him because his face split into a wicked, not at all friendly grin, and then he began tearing his way through the blackberry brambles towards me. I began running towards my house while screaming bloody murder. Even over my screams, I heard his feet slap on the pavement behind me. I got to my Uncle Mike's house, who lived next door, flung his door open to see what the hell was going on, and I began to scream and cry about the man that had chased me out of the woods. But by this point the man had disappeared. Mike hadn't seen him, so initially he thought I let my imagination run away with me. But when they looked at the area I said he'd emerged from, there was a clear area of broken brush and blood from where he'd been cut by the thorns. After they took their machete to cut away the brambles and investigate where he'd come from, they discovered an area he'd been standing in with a small pile of cigarette butts, like he stood there watching me for quite some time. A few weeks later, deeper in the woods, my mother's boyfriend and I discovered a small tent with assorted paraphernalia and very disturbing images. No one mentioned the connection, but I was very mature for my age, and when I thought about it, it disturbed me very much. So, stranger that departed your tent to watch me from the woods, let's not meet again. This is one of my earliest creepy encounters. I was probably between the ages of 11 and 13 at the time, and it must have been around 1995. It was the weekend because I was hanging out late with my best friend. One of our favorite things to do at that age was rent movies and pop enormous amounts of popcorn to drench in butter and salt. We nearly always did this at my place. My parents were cooler, and we could stay up a bit later, make more noise, and it also helped that we could walk to the video stop from my house. Imagine my house at one corner of the street and the video store at the other. It's about a 7-minute walk and on the same side. It must not have been super late, because we hadn't rented our movies yet, but it was dark in a brightly lit neighborhood. The video store was located at the edge of my neighborhood on a busy street. At the time, this street was known for the fact that it was always lined with sex workers. The women were not usually located near the video store, but sort of congregated further along in each direction. The motel one way, and bars and bowling alleys the other. My mum was always very open with me about dangers, and I was always very aware and alert on the street, even though I had never felt unsafe before. It is very populated, but I guess it attracted creeps nonetheless. As we were walking along the street from my house to the video store, the car passes us, and we pull over a little bit ahead. I remember it was a dented old hatchback, and the colors were rust orange. We didn't make note of it. It was a residential street, and that's where people parked. As we got closer, I did note the passenger window was down. As we passed, the man inside shouted, "Hey!" I whipped my head around and could see vaguely an older man between 35 and 45 with large 70s style glasses and a slightly bald head, maybe grey or light brown dishwater colour disheveled hair. I think he was wearing a dark jean jacket. I remember the buttons, just like jean jacket buttons and a collar. We turned back, kept walking and ignored him. He pulled ahead and stopped again. At that point I remember feeling hesitant. We both faltered in our walking, as if the instincts naturally halt your steps. But we did keep going at this time. As we passed, he said, "Hey girls, where you heading?" We didn't stop or look and kept walking. I remember my friend saying something quietly along the lines of, "What the hell?" The man started following us slowly alongside. At some point he said, "You girls look cold." I have no idea if it was cold, but I do remember the time of year. But I remember those words very clearly. "I could give you a ride." My friend actually responded, "We don't need a ride," and he continued to follow us a little ways, speaking to us. "Where you heading? What are your names? How old are you?" He kept pestering us with these questions. When we were about just half a block from the video store, we ran the rest of the way. We saw him turn left at the intersection heading away from the store, and we took our time in there, and were flustered and kind of edgy at that point. And I remember telling the kindly proprietor of the video store that some guy had been harassing us. We opted to take a different way home, and thank God we did, because he was parked behind the video store. We could see the car at the other end of the lot from our location, running with the lights on. It was a one-way parking lot with one row of spaces, and we were located at the exit end in an alley. But he was right next to the entrance, and I'm sure would have just pulled out the wrong way had we walked down that street. He must have seen us anyway, because he began backing out. My friend shouted something and began running down the alley. Not to be left behind, I booked it. I'm a quick runner, so before long I was ahead of her, and I heard her behind me. "He's there!" I told her to follow me, and I cut through one of the yards that had no back gate, and I was shouting at my friend to hurry, because we had to get to my house by the time he came out the other end of the alley, or he might see us going into my yard. Thank God we made it to my house in time. My house fronted the street he would have turned on. Knowing which direction we cut through, it was on a corner, and my backyard/fence ran along the street that we were running on at that point. We had one neighbor to the left side of the house, and directly next to them, the alley. We cut into my yard through the gate and closed it, but didn't move. The fence was taller than us. If we walked up the back stairs, he would have seen us. I watched through a very tiny crack between the boards, and sure enough, seconds later he passed by slowly. As soon as we were sure he was far away enough, just before he could come around again, we booked it to my house. I think we were saved by the fact the alley had several high, sharp speed bumps. If you tried to take those things faster than a crawl, you would wreck your car. And as long as I've been driving, I have loved those speed bumps. And I'm not proud of this now, but I never told my mum the whole story. I was afraid that she would enforce restrictions on my freedom, and I just told her some old guy was hollering us out of his car. This is when she gave me the fight for your life, then and there talk. If anyone ever tries to grab you, fight for your life, gorge their eyes, scratch their face, kick them where the sun doesn't shine, whatever you do, whatever it takes. Never let them get you to another location. Love you, Mum. This happened back on Christmas 2019, which means that it got dark outside pretty early. I've always enjoyed the dark, and you can say that I'm quite the horror fan, so I don't usually get scared that easily. Back then I was doing a robotics after-school activity with 2 of my friends. I don't anymore since the whole quarantine thing happened. I always took the school bus to go home, but it left me a little further away from my home because the bus driver needed to go a different route to leave the others, which meant I had to walk along 3 different streets in order to get home. As I said, I enjoy the dark, but in that particular place, it made me feel uncomfortable. That place being the first road I had to walk. It had only a few lights and was very long, but the thing that made me really uncomfortable was the fact that you would barely see other people. For the most part, every time I had to walk down the street, I was alone. The day the incident happened, I was about to start walking towards the buses because we were finished with our lessons. On my way, I was talking to a friend. We were basically chatting about what we were going to do in the afternoon, when out of nowhere I decided to tell him about the street. He seemed to make fun of the fact that it gave me chills, and I laughed too just because I didn't want to start an argument. At least, that's what I remember thinking. It was about 5:10 when the bus started to leave the school. It usually is about an hour-and-a-half ride because of the amount of kids they have to take, but I had no problem with that, and I just sat and did my own thing, listening to music and drawing on my sketchbook, and had a little chat with some people on the bus to kill some time. It was around 6:30 when I finally arrived at my stop, and as usual I had plenty of walking to do. The area was pretty illuminated as always, but when I started walking down the street, it felt like the power went down or something. As I walked deeper in, I started to lose the light of the area I started from. Now I know that some of you are probably going to be thinking that if this road bothered me so much, why didn't I tell my parents so they could change the stop or something? I was just shy to tell anyone really, in the fear that they'd make fun of me. Well, what I experienced didn't make it hilarious at all. As I was walking down, I thought I saw this old lady coming my way from the distance. I didn't think much of it. When we were too close and about to pass each other, I could see her face even better. I'm pretty sure that she was in her early 70s for sure, and she gave me this grumpy mad look. Now I'm used to being polite to others, no matter how bad they might be. So by the time I passed her, I just said, "Good evening," but she didn't respond. She kept staring at me and looked angry. After that, she walked right past me and mumbled the word, "Beware." I was a bit disturbed by that, but tried to ignore it since, it could mean anything. I kept walking down the street, and as I was going, I passed this house. It was sort of an old house that was on the right side of a small road for your car to get in, I guess. But it wasn't just that. I saw the outline of someone tall just standing there. I was 100% sure at that moment I passed, his eyes were glued on mine. But he did nothing, just stood there. After almost arriving to the end of the street, I froze when I heard the sounds of footsteps behind me. I tried to look back, and there he was. The same outline was right behind me, not moving, but I could understand that he was looking at me. I kept forward, pretending that I wasn't suspicious. One part of me said this man was dangerous, while the other said that he must have just been walking down the same street. The first part got the better of me, and I kept walking as I heard the footsteps persistently follow. When I reached the end of the street, I stopped and sighed, as he couldn't see me anymore, and I started to walk quicker down the other street. This one had cars, which was a huge relief. When I was finally outside my house, I pressed the doorbell. Usually my parents took a while to open the door, so I stayed there and waited. But then, The few seconds it took for them to come to the door, I could hear down the street, and it felt like the sound of someone running. I didn't think much of it at first, but started to feel worried while the footsteps came ever closer and louder. Standing by the door, as I saw him, the man from the street was sprinting. It looked like he was trying to find someone, and I felt my heart drop as I saw a glimpse of him running by. Thankfully, he didn't recognize me because of how fast he was going, but by the time I started pressing the bell consistently in panic, and it finally opened, I sprinted inside and told my parents everything. They told me it was just probably a random dude, minding his own business. I never told anyone after that, as I thought I'd be ridiculed, but I have a pretty strong indication in my gut that he was after me. Thankfully, I've never seen him again. The last 2 times I had an after-school class, my father came and picked me up at least. It's been about 5 months since the incident, but I don't think I'll ever forget the man with a spring in his step, shall we say. I had turned 18 just a few weeks ago, and due to the pandemic and all, I wouldn't be able to throw a big party. So I just had 2 of my closest friends over, Melissa and Clara, who were also 18. We planned instead to have some fun for the evening before I turned 18, make a fancy dinner, and have some fun. We didn't have any alcohol. It's legal to drink beer and wine and stuff at 16, and hard liquor at 18 where I live. Just as midnight rolled around, we celebrated. I unwrapped their gifts, one of which was one of those really realistic looking seal plushies. It's kind of an in-joke. I went through a phase where I found fat seals incredibly adorable, and got Instagram ads for those things all the time. Anyway, we were really hyped up at that point and decided to go for a walk with our music box and plushies at 1 AM. You know, as you do. And just for context, I live in a relatively small rural town next to a big lake. We get a bunch of tourists in the summer, and also have multiple clinics around, one for eating disorders and there's another rehab center. But it's usually really safe, and especially at night. So there we are, dancing, singing aloud on the empty streets, just having fun and enjoying my newfound adultness. We pass a few people on the streets, but they all seem normal and nice, and it's generally empty and deserted. As we approach a big empty parking lot, which we needed to pass in order to get back to my house, I noticed a guy in a dark hooded pullover coming from the parking lot and crossing the street to the side that we were walking on. We turned the music down as he passed, and he greeted us briefly in passing, as it's customary to do here in the countryside. We also greeted the other people that we previously passed, and we greeted him back. He appeared to be in his mid-30s, but seemed totally non-threatening and normal to us at that point. We thought nothing more of it, and walked on and turned the music back up. Now, in order to get to my home, we had to go through a small patch of woods, where there were no street lights nor empty houses. As we started approaching that area, a few minutes after we met the man, we suddenly started hearing talking from behind us, and realized someone was walking at least 10 meters away. At first, we thought he was talking to someone on the phone, and as it was pretty dark, we couldn't see if this was the case. When we passed one of the last streetlights before the patch of woods, we realized it was the same guy that had walked past us just a few minutes prior, who was walking in the opposite direction than us, and had turned around after he passed us in order to be right behind us now. That was when we really started to get creeped out. We also realized he wasn't on the phone because of the loud music we had on. We couldn't make out what he was saying, and in that moment I, for some reason, figured it would be a good idea to say, "They always have a knife with me." They later told me they actually brought it, but in reality we had nothing with us in case we had to defend ourselves. I kind of figured out that maybe it would scare the guy off, but it didn't. There was one last house, which was actually an inn that maybe we would pass before going into the patch of woods. I told my friends perhaps he was staying there, but we all agreed that if he kept following us at that point, it couldn't be a coincidence and that he was indeed following us. In hindsight, we should have just turned around at that point and stayed in the well-lit populated area, but I guess we weren't thinking very clearly. So we passed the inn and he was still following. One of us turned their phone flashlight on, as there were no more streetlights and it was pitch black where we were going. We kept turning around and checking if he was still behind us, each time increasing our walking speed more and more until we were practically running, but he kept getting closer and closer. My heart felt like it was going to beat out my chest. I was scared for my life. I kept thinking that he could have some kind of weapon with him or something to harm me. Then one of my friends, Melissa, stopped and turned around. Clara and me stood a few meters behind her, and immediately the guy approached her, asking her if we had any alcohol or cigarettes. She answered in a totally sober tone that we in fact didn't have anything with us. He took a few steps towards her, asking again if we really didn't have anything that we could give him. Melissa answered more firmly this time that we don't have anything, and the guy seemed desperate. At that point, Melissa said she was ready to kick him in the balls if he even took another step. She actually does kickboxing and stuff, so knows how to defend herself quite well. But still, he was a grown man and probably had more power than an 18-year-old girl. Clara and me were just frozen and didn't know what to do and just kept standing there saying nothing. He asked Melissa if we lived nearby or if we were here on vacation, to which she answered that we lived in the area, as she figured it's better if he thinks we know the area and the people well, so he wouldn't get any ideas. Luckily for us, after a few more attempts of reassuring him that we didn't have anything for him, I think the guy realized he was getting nowhere and decided to just turn around and walk away, leaving us scared half to death as we walked back to my house, glancing behind us every few seconds to check. We arrived safely at my home, still scared, and I locked the door behind us and triple-checked it. I couldn't really fall asleep that night, always thinking that I heard something outside. So creepy grown man who decided to follow 3 18-year-olds in the dark, in the middle of the woods at night? What the heck were you thinking? This happened a number of years ago, when I was in Naples, Italy with a friend. I go there a couple of times a year as my family lives nearby, but it was the first time I've ever gone there with only a female friend, Gabby. Prior to this trip, we were always accompanied by either my parents, my brother, or another male friend. Since I was practically raised in Naples, I knew the city very well, but it was Gabby's first time in Italy, so I wanted to show her interesting things. We went out every day. Immediately I started noticing that daily, at least a few times a day, guys would come up to us and make small talk. It felt weird, but we shrugged it off, thinking it was because we were young, not Italian-looking girls with crazy hair and styles. There were countless weird encounters throughout our whole stay in Italy, but I only want to focus on this one. Naples is a city that never sleeps, especially during the summer holidays. Adding to the fact that I knew the city very well, my family members we were staying with didn't object to us going out in the middle of the night. I decided to take Gabby to the walkway overlooking the sea. The street next to it was full of restaurants and bars, and we decided to sit down on a short wall that cut off the sidewalk from the beaches. We sat there for a while, talking and enjoying the view. Once we turned back to the sidewalk ready to go home, we saw 2 people approaching us. One was a teenager around our age, and the other was a gross-looking man in his 50s. The teenager was silent the whole time, but the man spoke after just staring at us for way too long. Since my friend can't speak Italian, I was the one who had to talk to the guy. He asked us how old we were. I told him we were both 15. I said that in a tone that would just make him leave, since we were clearly underage, but he kept going. He asked if we wanted to go out for a drink. I reminded him that we were both 15, and therefore too young. So he asked another question, if we wanted to go to his hotel room around the corner to smoke weed. That was when I freaked out. Clearly his intention was to lure us somewhere, but managed to only get us even more grossed out. I once again refused, but this time sharply said that we were really needing to get home, because I told my aunt that we had to be back by a certain time. We stood up and gave our goodbyes. When I was about to turn around, the guy grabbed my arm, looked at me, and said that he just wanted to teach him how to speak better Italian, gesturing to the teenager. I'm also creeped out that he didn't call him his son or friend or anything, just him. And we walked away. I took the longer way home on purpose just to make sure he wouldn't follow. I still don't know what happened back then first. First of all, why didn't he come back after I told him? I still don't know what happened back there. First of all, why didn't he back up after I told him we were underage? Second, why would he come up to us in order to teach the boy Italian, since none of us are Italian looking, and you can clearly see we're tourists? And last of all, who was this boy? Was he with this man? And what would have happened if he came up to someone else? Maybe someone drunk, willing to go somewhere with him. After this happened to me, my friend and I started to be way more careful. While being approached by older men, we immediately just say, "Sorry, no Italian," which usually made them go away since they didn't want to struggle with speaking in English. Anyway, now I feel safer walking around Naples with my parents or a dude I know, because no one ever approaches me while being accompanied by other people. Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed tonight's video. It's pretty fun. Being followed home certainly sounds creepy. Thankfully, it's never happened to me, at least not I can't remember it happening to me. Well, if you enjoyed the video, you know what to do, and if you want to follow me on Twitter, send your poop stories and or your stories from the state you live in if you live in the States. That'll be pretty cool as well. Was there something else? Oh yes, artwork. Send me your artwork. I'd love to see it. Pretty cool, creative stuff from you guys. I get some comments sometimes saying that you guys are drawing, and if you're drawing nothing in particular and want to share it, you can do that too. That's totally fine. Alright then guys, a huge thanks as always to my lovely members and patrons whose names can be seen on screen. Why not join for some cool perks like picking videos and other stuff which you can read about if you are truly interested. But for now, I think I'm going to sign off. Stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one.